Hollow sounds of the wind howling through crevices that give access to the light in this dimly lit cave. Like the ticking of a clock, drops of water fall from the damp ceiling, crashing into a small puddle, leaving ripples in its reflection. Ripples much like the echoes reverberating from the crooked walls. A dying animal cries for help. The polar opposite of a miscarriage, a woman giving birth to a life that is substituting hers. Her cervix expanding like a snake regurgitating a small calf. The baby's cries combated the mother's in unison. The child eventually triumphs as the life is siphoned from its creator and into the tiny vessel. Like a sign from the heavens, a small ray of light creates enough color to the shady images of the mother's lifeless body. Helpless, but still not alone in the dark, the baby is approached by a shadowy figure, the sounds of its feet much like the hooves of a horse. He approached and kneels before the child, cradled it in his arms, and began walking into the direction he destined in his mind. Like a black canvas glittered with distant stars, this city is a work of art during the night. Buildings tower over the small cars driving around and people flying about. They move in patterns that would resemble a plaid shirt as they go about their busy lives, more concerned about their next deadline than to give a small greeting to a passerby. However, this couple was different. Two angels wanting to go for a stroll on foot to enjoy the change of scenario. Conversation is disconnected between the two, however, as they approached a passage under a bridge. They whispered amongst one another, trying to locate the direction in which the anonymous sound was coming from. A crevice in the wall, a small entrance to a cave. Curiosity got the best of them as they approached the cave to find an answer to their question. They took a few steps in only to be greeted by what sounds like a child crying helplessly. The couple did not hesitate to pace themselves in the direction the baby was crying from. They only walked as fast as their eyes could see, as the environment was poorly lit. The crying stopped, their pacing reduced to a step-by-step stride, their act of heroism distorted into fear. No words were exchanged as the couple both emitted a strange vibe from the view ahead. As they were in distinguishable range, the horror creeped into their psyche as they saw the baby. As effortlessly as passing a knife through a piece of paper, the child's throat was severed. Small streams of blood painted his tiny body as the excess pooled at the ground behind him. The woman fell backwards, tripping over the rough surface of the cave. She watched her significant other, frozen stiff, just staring at the child. Her eyes welled with tears from the nightmare, her vision blurred by the water within them. With not even a second to spare, she closed her eyes. She could still see the image branded onto the back of her eyelids. Then she opened them to be introduced to a new horror. Her loved one, hoisted into the air, as his life-receding body is skewered by the horns of a minotaur. An alligator manhandling its fresh prey, the only way to describe how the blood splashed off his body as the devilish creature violently swung him from left to right. The demon lifted his chin high as the angel slid off his horns like a slab of meat on a carving fork. He gazes into her eyes with malevolence. She quickly turns around and began beating her wings against the ground, desperately taking flight in the claustrophobic surroundings. Her success was quickly halted by the thick hands of the creature's vice grip around her feet. Her screams muted by the heavy thud of her body as the creature swung her face first into the ground. Her left wing pinned by a heavy hand as he crawled on top of her. Her right wing pounding against the floor and the body of the creature, though futile. Still she tries to break free. His hands fought to get underneath her arm and make its way to her neck. The weight of the Minotaur on her back rendered her immobile, as her screams translated into gasps for air. Her eyes widened, her nails dug into the ground, slowly peeling from the tips of her fingers. Like CPR, air quickly escapes her lips in short bursts as his member is thrusted into her continually. Her vision fades, her senses numbed. Nothing but the percussive sounds from behind her, dissipating. A few months pass by, and any signs of missing people are swept under the rug. As the city struggles with overpopulation, small dents in their numbers are deemed minor compared to the major problems at hand. The city keeps moving, and all angels are too caught up in their own agenda to find the time to greet a passerby. Except for this one inquisitive young lady, always questioning the things that the mass all formally attend, always greeting people whenever she can, always reaching out even when she can't afford to. A tightrope balancing act, walking on the borders of tradition and blasphemy. She caught news of the recent rumors online about people disappearing near a bridge close to her area. Local media deemed it as just rumors and claimed criminal activity is just at an all-time high. Ignorant to the ignorance, she took some time off her busy day to investigate the location that the recent rumors are whispering about. She grabbed her phone and her backpack and decided to fly out to the destination. During the day, the streets are just as busy as it is at night. Most people travel by flight and seldomly walked. The bridge stretched over a large body of water, connecting to the other side of the city. Just below that is a rocky surface, the area brushed with a grayish-brown as the ground elevates into a hill. There lied a crevice in the wall of that hill, hidden behind the bushes. She retrieved her flashlight from her backpack and proceeded through the narrow entrance of the cave. The darkness quickly invites itself to her eyes, and her light shines back in response. As she traverses deeper into the hollow cave, she looked around, beaming with curiosity and fascination. The mystery of the cave sparked a sense of adventure within her, until her eyes came across something that resembled a small skull. Like flash paper, all sense of adventure is quickly burnt and left with no evidence except her anxious chills running down her spine. She continues to walk forward, slower, but still determined. However, her following step petrified as a baritone voice reached out to her from the shadows. "There is a fine line between bravery and stupidity, Egret. Don't make another move." The angel stood motionless at the tremble of his voice. The sound of his hooves heavily approached her and then paused. She could feel the weight of his exhales collapsing on the back of her neck, rippling the red top she wore that day. The hooves faded back into the shadows. "Look in the direction from whence you came and leave this place." Her heart racing but still determined, she took a chance and directed her light and her words towards him. I read about you. I know who you are," she said in a burst of confidence. The light shined and casted small shadows on his back, engraving the details of his bulk. His head and his eyes peering cautiously over his shoulder, the Minotaur scoffed and said, "You know nothing, Egret. Now leave this place before I contemplate my decision a third time." In response, she said, "I know about the Holy War and the existence of your kind, and what we did to your people." The Minotaur sat back into his corner and leaned his massive head back against the wall. "What of your halo? Do you know why it's fractured?" She responded with uncertainty. "Exactly. You haven't the slightest clue of our similarities. Now please, leave. I need my rest." She felt defenseless in all his responses, so she began making her way to the exit. "My name is Sanseve, by the way," she responded in anticipation, only to be met by the Z's from his sleeping. Though unexpected and a bit scary, she found herself lost in the traversal of her thoughts as she grew fond of meeting him again. One question followed by another. The more she questioned, the more she realized it was inevitable not to reinvite herself. Why let me go? Why not kill me? What of my halo? She pondered on those thoughts, but no matter how many times she tried to match them with an answer, it was the equivalent of rolling a 20-sided die and expecting the same result twice. The odds are better if she had went back. She's always been selfless, but this time she wanted to know more about herself. It's evident he knows something about her that she hasn't been aware of. She spent the night building up enough courage and most of the day consumed with her thoughts until she found herself back where it all began. She gently pressed her hands against her chest, as if she was trying to cradle her heart to a comfortable pacing before heading in. The darkness and the general atmosphere of the cave did not weigh as much on her heart in comparison to the unfathomable variety of outcomes he would have once he knew of her presence again. Once again, the thunder in his voice struck a simultaneous fear and relief in her core. "Perhaps you are a fool after all." He struck firmly, but she struck back. "It's because of my halo, isn't it? Otherwise, why would you let me go? You knew I would come back. I would be a fool not to." She beamed her eyes to the shadow of his general direction. His silence bared no fruit, as the question she soiled the air with was left unanswered. The water droplets from the ceiling grew louder. Every second she anticipated an answer. "Well?" she shouted out, breaking the silence. He walked into a beam of light closest to her, slowly revealing, placing a face to the mysterious voice in the shadows. Rigid horns, as sturdy as a steel beam, protruding from his temples. Eyes of the abyss that resembled staring into a black mirror. Facial structure very similar to a battle-scarred bull. He reflected her gaze through the eyes of his own, then he responded, "Bear witness to my existence, for the truth be the same." While acknowledging his words of advice, she never broke eye contact, for she was never attracted to the lies that coded the secrets in this world. He began by telling her about the war and what sparked the conflict. Holy war, a paradox to those who have the intelligence to decipher the meaning. For the mass, it's less about the meaning and more about the feelings invoked behind the message. They speak condescendingly towards my kind. Cannibals, devourer of the flesh, man-eaters. Judgment deriving from a kind that treats animals no different. Blue sky with crimson confetti versus the more grounded canvas painted with strokes of scarlet. A never-ending war between angels and demons. Do you see where I'm going with this? He looked at her, with his head slightly tilted, and she nodded in anticipation, insisting he continued. Knowledge is power, and power corrupts. Angels invoke emotions over logic, and find bliss in ignorance. At birth, we were all once angels. Once you discover the truth behind your world, the wings peel off like scabs, and the halo shatters away. At first, she was puzzled. To make the pieces fit, she asked, So, you were an angel? He sat down, fully expecting her not to believe a word of what he said, and with that notion he responded, Satan wasn't the only fallen angel, and Adam and Eve weren't the only angels God created. They all are just the first few to transition into what you see now. She sat motionless, trying to absorb the information she just heard, only breaking eye contact to digest everything. Almost as if she forgot to breathe for a second, she drew her breath, and with that gust of air that escaped her lips, she muffled, "Whoa." Is it too late to ask if this fallen angel has a name? Naivax. From that moment on, they spent the entirety of the days with each other. She only did the necessities while replacing her leisure activities with more time spent with him. He became her encyclopedia of the hidden secrets that built the society she lived in, and he resides in the shadows it casts. She took a liking to him, and her questions shifted slightly towards his experiences as her feelings enveloped much like a snake plant, still growing ever so steady, even if his world was significantly darker than hers ever would be. She packed for two this time, before entering his home. Having questions about his diet, she thought it would be a good conversation starter if she brought a variety of snacks and fruits with her. "What are you up to this time?" Naivax squinted in suspicion. She opened up her bag and began assembling a small display of snacks and fruits as she responded with, "I've never seen you eat. You've told me you were a carnivore, but is it because you've never ate your fruits and veggies as a kid?" He brushed off her attempt at humor and firmly replied, "We don't get hungry as frequently as you angels do. The purer the meal, the more fulfilling we feel. Being a herbivore is as feasible as trying to change a lion's diet. Still, it bared no justice in the eyes of your people. They shunned us simply because our meat was different from the factories that they create to produce their own. Perhaps we like eating less intelligent creatures too." That right there. Yes. Hand it over. Navax's eyes darted the red apple with intent. Sansevej laughed cheerfully as she handed the red apple to him. Effortlessly, he chomped and grinded the apple down into his stomach. Overindulging in a rare opportunity, a coy smile formed on his lips as he noticed her laughing. "Oh, what's this?" She grinned playfully as she revealed another apple from her bag. Navax formed an enthusiastic stance as if to impersonate a giant puppy wanting to play catch. He stomped around on all fours and circled around waiting for Sansevej to toss the apple. She laughed as he ran off chasing the apple into the darkness. Perhaps she felt something in that playful moment that settled her down to her next question. "Navax, if I'm exactly as you described, does that mean you feel no emotion?" Eating the apple carefully around its core, he began telling her the spectrum is not of two extremes, that they would lose that bond that makes the two races similar if both were truly complete opposites. She sighed in relief and told him that even if he is 90% logic and 10% emotion, she believed that she is starting to have a considerable amount of feelings for him. His wrists loosened as the core of the apple fell from his mouth and hung downward, clutched between his thumb and his index finger. "Why would you do something like that? Have you forgotten everything I told you? Do you not see the monster that stands before you?" He himself was puzzled on whether his questions were truly that rhetorical. The look in her eyes, she spoke no words, but her face, like a picture, elaborated 1,000. The white hourglass body of the apple core brushed brown, tainted from the exposure of the air. It fell from his hand as he stood up, carried her in his arms, and took her further into the cave. The fear she had once felt when she invited herself in was no longer apparent. She trusted him and did not hesitate to comply. She stood firmly as he released her gently on her feet. What she laid eyes on after that had undoubtedly exceeded her expectation of what he did to survive. Navax watched her in silence, expecting the worst possible reaction and prepared to bear the consequences behind it. He watched her bashful eyes shift around rapidly as her mind engraved every little detail of the small room. A shelf filled with books, primal decorations on the wall. Looking down, her eyes met bones littered everywhere, both animal and human. And that scent. Her eyes scanned the surroundings in the dim light, searching for the fitting image her mind greeted from that god-awful scent. A smell so horrendous, it painted a clear image that any man or infant could decipher. That's when their eyes met. A woman, her hands tied behind her back. Her once silk-white wings were now tarnished brown and yellow. Bloodshot eyes that towed a heavy baggage beneath them. She appeared to be physically functional, but her will to escape was completely broken. To the point where she sat comfortably in the nest of urine and fecal matter that she made for herself. The only glimmer that tethered her to this world was the life brewing in her body. I killed her fiancé after they both took the bait I laid out. I spared her life simply so she could be a vessel, my cattle for my children, my survival. Navax stood shameless, but more so emotionally muted as he prepared his ears for a subtle response that would resemble a falling glass wall. The shock that originally sketched Sansave's reaction slowly lost its sleight of hand. Her resolve was not of an emotional one, as she came to a realization of how cold the world truly is. She was more aware of the history he presented her prior. However, seeing a portion this closely is much like witnessing microscopic organisms for the first time under a microscope. Given the circumstances, what choice did you have? If I were placed in the same situation, I would have either died or be led to the same carbon footprint that you have now. Thus, my feelings towards you have not changed. Sansave's eyes spoke to him much like her words, without stumble or stutter. No matter how many times it has weathered him, even given his current state of mind, no book nor any man with an unlimited source of knowledge, with just a pint of emotion, is enough to be exposed to the inevitable power of a bond between two people. Sansave being closer in proximity, her attention has been diverted to the woman laughing maniacally on the ground. The woman erected on all fours, her head hung low as her long, muddy blonde hair draped over her face, like curtains disguising anticipation. She sprung forth with a burst of kinetic energy, like an anchor leg at a relay race. A percussive thud occurred as Sansave was thrown off her balance and onto her back. She struggled for a second to keep the hands of the maddened woman from piercing her jugular with a broken bone as a weapon. Like a gust of wind and a tremor in the ground, Naivax came crashing into the woman. His horn rammed into her cranium as her face split from the sheer force. The impact had blood sneezed onto Sansave's torso. The sound of a large tree being pulled from its root resembled the way the maddened woman's spinal cord shifted as he flung her away from Sansave. The lifeless body breathed relief and concern into both of their eyes. Naivax exited the room and sat down, and Sansave followed suit next to him. She rested her head on his side, both of them contemplating what they could do for each other to fix this mess. She broke the silence when she began taking her shirt off. He thought nothing of it until she began holding his arm in a gentle motion, softly brushing her bra on the side of his arm. Sanse, no, I can't do that to you, he said softly as he loosened his arm from her grasp. She asked him, what other choice do you have? This is the best course of action to avoid taking more lives and keeping you sustained in the future. It was both an emotional and a logical decision. He understood, and it was tempting. However, He didn't want to put her life in danger because of what happened to the last woman he impregnated. He spoke to her, calmly saying, "She died giving birth to the child. There are too many variables at hand, and one I can't ignore is my seed may not be suited for an angel's body, and I won't risk your life so I could go back to reading books in solitude." Navax resumed thinking to himself again. Sansevay appreciated his concern, but she wanted to help him, regardless of her first failed attempt. Turning her shirt inside out, she carefully placed it over her head. She calmly packed her belongings and hoisted her backpack over her shoulders, exiting the cave in silence. The cave has never felt so empty to him before, his thoughts interrupted by the gentle reminder of where she once stood an hour ago. The sand trickled loudest that night through the hourglass. His affection battled the thoughts of hunger in his stomach, insatiable the two, as necessity bounces between them like a pendulum. He approaches the aftermath in the room and laid eyes upon the once maddened woman's mangled body, flies being summoned by the scent of death. He approaches her in the softly lit room. Her intoxicating smile extracted the very essence of the joys of life. Caressing her body, he could feel the warmth of her skin, radiating against his palms as he traversed from her breast to her waist. With careful novice surgery, he knelt before her, using a sharp bone to carve around her stomach, bearing fruit to the premature delicacy. His rhythm increased in pacing as the music between the two increased in volume. As he blossomed within her, the seeds took comfort in the soil of her body. He tore it limb from limb, saving the biggest piece for last. As the gears of his jaws were in motion, each swallow salves his hunger for another day. As the terminology of life and death intertwined between the two scenarios, the yin-yang that defines the balance that creates the world in orbit, inevitable to have one without the other. Sansevay woke up with a small hangover. She had slept through the entirety of the day. At least it was the weekend, so she need not worry about anything except him. She immediately packed her things and flew off to go pay a visit. She was particularly happy tonight. However, idle eyes fixated on her return. Her heart sank as she flew by the building that obstructed her view. Red and blue lights flashing sporadically, the heavy beating of wings shifting the air in the perimeter around the cave. Dozens of civilians gathered behind the perimeter that the police created. Tears welled at her eyes as she realized Navax was in grave danger. Without hesitation or decisive plan, she flew directly towards the entrance, disregarding the consequences. A group of uniformed men obstructed her and restrained her from flying any closer. "Ma'am, this perimeter is off limits. We advise you to turn away." They spoke sternly and repeatedly as they disregarded her efforts to ignore them. She increasingly became more aggressive as her eyes glistened with tears. She shouted, "Get your hands off of me! Let me go!" A group of higher-ranked officers approached the commotion in her defense. "Let the lady go." "But sir, do not let me repeat myself again. Release her." She lost altitude as she reformed herself and flew directly to the mouth of the cave. The men inside had firearms and flashlights in hand, fumbling over their fallen teammates. The darkness of the cave held the secrets it maintained with many nooks and crannies. She ran through them with ease. A few men followed her, ignoring the recent radio chatter. She knew exactly where he might be, and as she swiftly turned the corner and entered the room, a large hand viced her around the neck and flung her to the ground. She tumbled aside, choking for air. She looked up to see him, furious, but focused on the two men approaching. The first man turned the corner, greeted by a blunt force as he was clotheslined to the ground. The second man appeared around the corner and managed to fire 2 rounds off before a river of blood gushed from his mouth. Like a sinking ship, his lungs filled rapidly with liquid as he felt the after effect of a cannonball force ram through his chest. Navax raised his hoof and effortlessly crushed the head of the last straggler pending his death. "You have some nerve coming back in here after the shitstorm you rained on me tonight." The coarseness of his voice symbolized the exhaustion he was enduring. She yelled at him, feeling completely offended that he could ever assume she would do such a thing. "Navax, I wanted to wait a few weeks to be certain. I only left the other day as hastily as I did because I wanted to preserve food for you, but I'm certain I'm pregnant." He paused for a second. Sanseve quickly crawled over to him in utter shock as he tilted backwards and slammed into the ground. 2 holes had punctured his abdomen as the blood slowly became more apparent. He was losing a lot of it. She tried to apply pressure, but quickly removed her hand as he grunted in sheer pain. The bullets were still inside. She cried helplessly, begging him to tell her what to do as she desperately searched for a way to aid him. "Sansa, listen to me. There is a hefty-sized book on that shelf. I absolutely need you to take it for me. Please, hurry." He tried with all his being to cover his wound as his blood slithered through the narrow spaces of his fingers. She stumbled on the sight of the book like the size of a Bible, and she clutched it in her arms as she immediately fell back by his feet. "Please don't leave me here. I've only just met you. You can't go now." The sense of desperation at the tip of her throat as she watched him slowly bounce between the borders of consciousness. "Climb the shelf. Remove the decoration. There is a small space you can crawl through." He quickly formed his words as the faint beams of light from the door began increasing in brightness. Her griefing immobilized her as she wanted nothing more but to stay by his side. "Go! We haven't the time for this!" he shouted at her in an attempt to jumpstart her legs. Her body unsturdy from the excessive sobbing. She didn't want his efforts to be in vain. She climbed the shelf and tore down the decoration and began shuffling her way to the surface. The spacing of the tunnel was too narrow to look back, even though she wanted to see him one more time. One more time wasn't enough, so she continued crawling forward. Multiple angels stormed into the room with frequent radio chatter. All eyes were on him when they entered. The voices muffled as she grew distant from them, but she was certain one of the men mentioned Medevac as he spoke through his radio. Her heart filled with uncertainty, but one word lingered in mind as she flew low over the river. Hope.